Thank you, Tim. Hi, everyone. It's great to see you again. So many people, I see very new faces here. Uh, we'll probably do some introduction if we have time, as Tim mentioned before. So today we have Dr. Ben Weinstein, who is a research scientist at the University of Florida. Thanks to Aditya for the connection. In his talk today titled Individual Tree Prediction from Above, Ben will talk about the use of airborne data collection and its potential for forest monitoring, which I think is a service interesting to the SERVIR community. So it will be interesting to see his talk today. His research group used machine learning and leveraged high resolution sensor data and has successfully generated comprehensive individual tree maps that cover vast geographic areas here in the US with the National Ecological Observatory Network, commonly known as NEON. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Ben Weinstein. Over to you, Ben. Thank you so much for agreeing to talk to our group.
Absolutely. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming. You're welcome to stop me wherever, and if anything technical difficulties, just let me know. And so I want to talk today about the work we've been doing the last several years on individual tree prediction with NEON, the National Ecological Observatory Network. I want to say that although I've been the technical lead on this work, I need to thank all of our collaborators at the University of Florida and Dr. Ethan White, who's been leading this project, as we have really made great strides in the last few years, and it wouldn't have happened without a very large team. The challenge we're going to talk about today is quite simple to explain and very difficult to do. We are going to try to talk about individual tree prediction from airborne sensors. And by individual tree prediction, I mean describing the location, species, health status, structure data from individual organisms. And we'll talk about what that might mean later. And we're going to be thinking about airborne data as a general class of sensor data. So that might include drone data, that might include piloted aircraft, that might include satellite data. The vast majority of work at NEON is done through piloted aircraft around that sort of 10 centimeter range. And we could talk about scaling up and scaling down later in the talk. But essentially what we're trying to do is, if you imagine a tile of images, a tile of trees, we're trying to associate metadata with each individual tree that is visible in that sensor structure. I like doing talks backwards a little bit. There's no reveal here. There's no rabbit in the hat. This is what I hope to convince you of today. If these takeaways are not of particular interest to you, then I'm sure each of you have lots to do with your hour. So I like to kind of reveal what we're going for here. And so what I hope to convince you of are these four essential tenets: that machine learning can generate reasonable predictions of individual crowns with species using a combination of high resolution sensors. Generalization across space and time will require combining supervision with clever ways to find synthetic labels. Scaling to coarser resolutions, as I'm sure many of you are interested in, from near global scale monitoring will require a radical improvement in algorithm development, data sharing, and computational resources, and that the future is bright, but we must be honest and open about algorithm performance, reproducibility, and uncertainty in predictions. This is what we're going to try to go through in the next 40 minutes. And I hope to return to this at the end and see where we are. And I welcome feedback about how convincing we've been in trying to look at each of these takeaways. I also want to point out right at the top that the University of Florida and Dr. White's lab, we are aggressively open source. And so anything you see today should be available, all models, all data. We are looking always for collaborators, for input, for random thoughts that you throw at us. There is, as we like to say, a lifetime of research covering this area. I cannot stress enough how much we have hour-long meetings in which we generate decades worth of research that we'll not be able to do because there's just not enough time. And so if any of you see something here that motivates you for your particular research project, for your thing, we're explicitly designing the tools and data such that others can take it and run with it because we believe there's so much promise here and frankly, just not enough people to do it. The work we've been describing, I was looking at some talks that was given to this group on YouTube, and it looked like a lot of the talks go through a single paper in some kind of detail, right? And I decided that would be fun, but would probably miss the larger narrative of what we've been trying to do. And so over the last few years, we've published 8 or 9 papers now on a range of topics, but they all essentially are trying to move in this one direction. And so I'll be kind of talking about multiple papers. And so going to Google Scholar is the best way to find which individual paper relies to which piece of data. Because what we're trying to do at a broad scale is develop what I would call tree maps, individual tree crown associations. And so we kind of chronologically moved from crown detection, meaning that how do we draw bounding boxes around individual trees, towards species prediction after we've developed crown detections. And ultimately, we're working towards what I see as tree maps. Here's an example from Ordway Swisher Biological Station in Florida. It's one of the neon sites. And you're looking at a million individual trees, each color-coded by their predicted species, and each of them have a bounding box associated with them, a height from the LiDAR data. And so while I take you through this process, I think it's important to realize where we're going and why we need each of these steps. Is essentially we need to create very large-scale geospatial data that maintains its individual level fidelity. And each of these steps has sort of been captured in different papers, which I can direct you to. Okay, so let's get to those first 2 takeaways. What are we trying to learn right now? Well, let's first talk about how we get to individual tree predictions as a set of geographic locations. And so let's go a little bit into the data. Some of you might be familiar with NEON. We are going to be talking about 10 centimeter RGB data. About 1 meter HSI data has 369 bands, which we reduce. And LiDAR, which while I made this nice visualization, in truth, it very rarely looks like this. It's usually 4 to 5 points per meter, and not the 40 points per meter that you can see here. This was just a nice thing at one of the sites. And so we have that data to play with. There are 45 or so geographic sites that are collected near annually for all these data sets by the same set of acquisition sensors. And so we're moving on 3 or 4 years of this now, depending on the geographic area. And I think a ballpark estimate is probably somewhere in the range of a half petabyte of remote sensing data, depending on the different products. The HSI product takes a lot of data compared to the RGB, for example. And so we've got a tremendous amount of unlabeled data, both spatially and temporally. I'm sure this is a similar situation for many of the NASA data products. And so I think thinking about this as a giant corpus of data and how do we start exploring it is useful when thinking about approaching a new set of sensor acquisition products. It should be said that tree detection is hard. It was never lost on us that the thing we were trying to achieve was somewhat difficult. The reason that it's hard is useful to break down into smaller pieces, which we can then attack. The first, I would say, is that a tree as a single class is a globally variable and fuzzy definition, right? Not only is it hard to tell what a tree is taxonomically at the edges, but also literally in the sense of what one tree is, can be very difficult to pin down. The center case is quite clear, right? You see a conifer and you're like, that thing's a tree. But everything else towards the edges can be very difficult. What about multi-bole trees? What about when the canopy comes together? How do we even tell what one tree is? So I would say we spent the first year just debating among the remote sensors, the forest ecologists, and the data scientists in the group, like, is that thing a tree? Is that thing a tree? We just spent a lot of time clicking on stuff and bringing up just images that we would then cross predict. So like one person would like make a bounding box, like, I think that's one tree. And then another person would say, I think that's one tree. And we did a lot of this, and we would argue about what one tree was. And you wouldn't believe the amount of time that people can spend arguing about how many trees are in a 40 by 40 meter image for hours, really. It's delightful. And so I think it should be stressed that it is difficult from the human perspective to even delineate what we mean by a single tree. And I don't think that should stop us. I like to sometimes think about the astronomy community in the sense that it may be hard to tell what an individual star is, but there's still a virtue in trying to count all of them. We also should say that the product is difficult because of scale variation. Trees can be big, trees can be small. They're going to look different in Madagascar than they are in Canada. And so it can be difficult to describe a single class at a broad scale. And the training data here, while we know a lot about trees, was really lacking, right? We're talking about bounding boxes on individual trees. And before this project, there's been a little bit of work since, but this was, I'd say 2020. There was not a huge data set. There's not a million bounding box tree data set out there that we could have just grabbed. And so I spent a lot of time the first year just clicking on trees. And it was valuable, and I highly recommend it as a soothing task for all of you. This is not a new area of work. This is one of the canonical areas of remote sensing for the environment. And so we didn't want to ignore what had happened before. And so I did a lot of reading about what it is that the community had come up with circa 2020. And it was very clear that there was sort of two general workflows. Most of them came from the LiDAR, and they involved sort of what I would call handcrafted features. I think of them as heuristic algorithms, which described a series of rules, usually that were interpretable by humans, that we would use to delineate what an individual tree was. And they all kind of went like this. Like, look at the LiDAR point cloud, find the top of the point cloud, come up with a series of rules about which points would be agglomerated to that tree, at some point come up with a stopping rule. This is a perfectly reasonable strategy in an unsupervised context. The challenge is that there's simply both not enough parameters to describe all the trees on Earth, and also too many parameters to fit by hand. And what you could do was turn the knobs of this algorithm, any of them, this is a nice one from John Williams, and for any individual geographic area, you could make it work. For any one site, if you just carefully tuned these parameters, you could make this thing work. And the challenge is that when we were looking at neon, 40 sites, all of the types of trees in the United States, there was no global optimum that we could even fit in an algorithmic sense, even automating looking through these things. There was just simply too many trade-offs. And so what we hoped to do was move from heuristic, brittle, handcrafted features towards deeply learned, robust features. And this mirrors the larger, I think, narrative of remote sensing and machine learning over the last 2 decades. This has been a fairly common transition. And so this is actually pretty old at this point, but this is a paper from 2019, I think, 2020, where we came up with what we thought was a reasonable first attempt at crown delineation using deep learning methods. So I'll walk through this in some detail because I think it's highlights important strategies, not just for this, but for remote sensing in general. And so here we're going to take airborne LiDAR data. We're going to turn it into a canopy height model, which many of you are familiar with. That is to say, take the top return for each of the LiDAR points and create a raster. We're going to use one of these unsupervised tree prediction algorithms that already existed. It was freely available, and in our package, it was easy. We are going to then extract the locations of those putative tree locations. And I think it should be obvious that, like, if those algorithms were sufficient, we wouldn't need to do anything else, right? We'd already be done. It's because the algorithms were not sufficient that more work was needed, right? And so we're going to go from the LiDAR to the RGB. So we'll have putative tree locations. We're going to label them in the RGB now. We'll do some deep learning pre-training, fairly standard RetinaNet object detection models. And the key thing here is we're going to do this left side of the loop millions of times. We're going to pre-train the algorithm millions, tens of millions of times in things that we think look like trees, right? They're pretty good, but they're not perfect. And so this left-hand side is our pre-training. Then we're going to take hand annotated trees. These are literally things that I clicked on, tens of thousands of boxes of different geographic areas, and refine this deep learning algorithm for individual tree predictions. Why does this might work, right? This is not novel. This is sort of a semi-supervised, or nomenclature can be hard, a self-supervised approach, a weak transfer approach. whatever we want to call it. Why might this work? I think about it this way. So I have a 6-year-old kid, and when you teach children to read, you don't just like hand them Shakespeare. You don't just hand them really high quality literature, right? You teach them words, you teach them letters, you teach them paragraphs. You develop the vocabulary of features that allows them to then be ready for something. A lot of remote sensing papers I see just hand completely naive 6-year-olds Shakespeare. They use ImageNet backbones and then incredibly expensive, high quality annotations. And they're like, to be or not to be algorithm. And that to me is what I see all the time, is that we have algorithms that are completely naive, that know the color red, and now we're providing them iambic pentameter. I think this is a common challenge that we have right now, that we need to move towards reasonable baseline backbone models in remote sensing that do more than know about ImageNet. And so what we hope to do here is look at the different performance of these scales, and then we can see how this thing happened. I should say at the time, we had no idea if this was going to work. This was somewhat funny that, you have this idea, and then we're just like, okay, let's see what happens. So this is the performance of that unsupervised algorithm. It's Silva et al. And the R package, LiDAR. And it performs reasonably well, right? It's okay. You get some trees, some weak recall, some weak precision, but they're tree-like objects. This is going to be compared to hand-annotated data that we've held out to the side. We're going to do this left-hand side millions of times from different geographic areas, and we're going to pre-train that network. These are what individual tree predictions look like from that Carlos Silva algorithm and overlaid on the RGB, right? So this is a LiDAR-based algorithm, but you're looking at it from the RGB, since this is the sensor we're going to use forward. And you can see why this might be challenging, right? We've got no real spectral data in the RGB, so it doesn't know the difference between rocks and trees. This is one tree that's been delineated into multiple. And you might say, oh, well, you can change the parameters. But I assure you, there's no optimal set of parameters on the scale of millions of trees. And so any time you change one thing, you get one tree looks better, and you fix it, and you get another tree looks better. And my sneaking suspicion is that for a large portion of the tree detection literature, the algorithms have been hand-tuned to evaluation data to look really good. And that, I think, is one of the fundamental challenges that when you came into the field, you were like, oh, we got 90% accuracy in all these papers. It just wasn't my lived experience testing out as many of them as I could reproduce that we got those kind of evaluation scores. So this is what it looks like. We're going to use these, turn them into bounding boxes and use them as pre-training data, but on very massive scales. Here's what I've called it self-supervised. I think I regret this term now, but this slide is old. And so this is what the performance looks like. Basically, this is what you get from going from LiDAR to RGB, right? You're learning deep features, but on weak data. We're now going to add in that Shakespeare and see what happens. I gotta tell you, we didn't know what was going to happen with this one. I was pretty surprised. And it seems almost crazy, right? Because you've gone from a large number of data sets or sort of data points to a much smaller number of data points. And it was very possible it was just going to overfit. It's not obvious this was going to work, right? Because this line came up with millions of trees, tens of millions of trees. This is tens of thousands of trees. And so it wasn't clear we were going to be able to move the needle at all. But it was successful in that regard. And so this was, I think, our first example about a pathway forward for remote sensing in domain transfer, using unsupervised algorithms to generate very large data sets, using deep learning networks to then learn from those data sets, and then refining them with high quality data. To look at a couple examples of how this plays out, if you look, here is the unsupervised algorithm performance. Here is the deeply learned RGB representation of that unsupervised algorithm performance. And so what you see is, I would say, the ghost of that weak data, right? You see some over-segmentation here, as there was over-segmentation here. And then here is the human annotated fine-tuned performance. And what's both interesting is the algorithm gets better as well as more confident. Now, whether those confidence are highly calibrated is a totally other question, but at least it gets more confident. It's really important that we move towards field-based verifications of these things, not just images, because, as I said, it's very hard to tell if you're doing the right thing or if you're just mimicking what humans think individual trees look like from above. And so we did use some field validated crowns that were collected by researchers standing in the field with an iPad, looking up at the canopy and then tracing on a image what they believe the crown looked like. This is very difficult work in terms of its ability to scale, right? You're literally walking out to trees, looking up at them and then drawing them. And so this can only be done for such scales, but I highly recommend this kind of field verification in just making you feel more confident, right? We're never going to believe about. I heard the computer scientists in our group once called them evaluation rumors or ground truth rumors, right? We're never really going to believe that the exact score of our algorithm is 72%. But that's what we've evaluated with the data we have available. And I tried not to get tied down into 74% or 72% or 80%, right? It's going to be a range of scores based on your evaluation conditions. And so I think that this is a good first step. In no way are we done. There is an entire set of data sets that we haven't even included yet, just haven't gotten back to. And there are really key areas that we know the model fails, but it is a reasonable first attempt at tree prediction from these scales. We wanted to make this available as soon as possible to a large set of researchers. We wrapped it into a Python package, which we call Deep Forest. It turns out there's an environmental consulting agency that just took the name, so we're going to see how the disambiguation works with that. But we applied this to a large set of geographic areas, and the green here are human annotated boxes. I think I flipped it. The black here are human annotated boxes, and the green are predictions from a variety of neon sites and geographic areas. Some of them are more convincing than others. None of it's a mystery. Deep canopy forests with very consistent crowns that are almost a blanket on the forest are harder than open savanna. None of you should be surprised by that. And we see generally about a 70% performance, which I feel very satisfied with. This works at a near global scale. Anywhere we can find data. I wake up in the middle of the night like, oh, it's going to be today that they're going to find an example where this doesn't work. But it hasn't happened yet. China, Madagascar, South Africa, we've applied this data very broadly. And for all the geoforms that we can find, it provides reasonable predictions. We always think about this as a backbone for fine-tuning. In no way should this be seen as a single omnipresent model. Instead think about it as a place to start, which you can then fine-tune. And the open source Python package provides avenues for fine-tuning in a fairly straightforward way. Deep Forest has gotten more response than I had anticipated, that we had budgeted for, that we had planned on. When I released it, along with my collaborators, I think I thought of it as a way to generate tree predictions at neon sites. Right? It was like, oh, there'll be more neon data in the future. We should use this algorithm again. This has not been the case. Deep Forest takes up probably far too much of our time just helping issues. It has been applied on all sorts of sensors and trees, also not trees. We have a bird detection model now. People have used it for cows. It has been a ongoing challenge in my mind about how much support for Deep Forest we should provide, because it's very clear the community is looking for simple Python APIs for training remote sensing deep learning networks. That much is clear because we're getting issues daily. We have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of downloads, and it's one of those things wherein you released it and you thought you had a use case, and it's clear that the community has other ideas. And so I welcome feedback about where Deep Forest should go. Some of you might have used it. And we are interested in trying to expand this and thinking about a general platform for remote sensing for deep learning. Is that a good idea? What should that look like? I'm looking for feedback in the channel, and you're welcome to write me personally. Where should we go with this? Because we're actively thinking about new grants, but it's a wide world here, and we don't quite know what the community needs, and so I'm always looking for feedback there. I want to again highlight that there is more to learn here than we could possibly do. Many of you are going to ask, and it's probably the most common question, how to take the 10 centimeter model and do other sensor arrays with it. So I would say that in general, if someone's looking for a PhD topic, a domain transfer among sensors in this object detection framework is very understudied. How do you take 10 centimeter data, a 10 centimeter backbone, not data, 10 centimeter backbone, and use it most effectively for 60 centimeter data, for 30 centimeter data? How do you scale across those domains easily? You might think, for example, it would be reasonable to think that you would just maintain a focal view. Some of you are thinking that right now. Well, if it was 40 meters and 10 centimeters, and now you've gone to 20 centimeters, just double the focal, double the number of cells, and you'll maintain a 40-meter focal view, for example. That is a perfectly reasonable idea that is completely wrong. We've shown that the performance is not scalable linearly with the focal view. In fact, somewhat strangely, if you want to predict on coarser data, you should make a much larger focal view. I believe this has something to do with how the anchor boxes are generated in object detection networks. I'm happy to talk about that in a technical detail if there's questions here. But I would say that the black magic of deep learning combined with the cross-sensor array of remote sensing is a very rich ground, and I think genuinely understudied. I can come up with a ton of different ideas here about how we might go from 10 centimeters to 50 centimeters in the most appropriate way. I also want to have a note of caution here, which is that I still don't really know what we mean by individual trees when we start talking about 30, 40, 50 centimeter data. I had a meeting with Planet. I've had a meeting with Maxar. Everyone's trying to do this. Some of them are using Deep Forest. What does it mean to try to predict individual trees at those resolutions? How would we validate that? And what ecological questions are, or any kinds of questions, forestry questions, are appropriate at those spatial arrays? It's not clear to me, and I think it's a huge area of need, especially in the sort of carbon credit reforestation questions, which many, perhaps some of you have. Ground verification of individual trees remains a huge question in my mind. We released a large number of putative crowns for all the NEON sites that we had sufficient data for. It's online right now on Zenodo. If you would like to peruse 100 million trees, you are welcome to. It's fun. You will see some really nice segmentations. You will no doubt find some segmentations that don't look so good. And so we think about this as the first step, and we are trying to think about how we bring the community into this. Again, we couldn't possibly do this all ourselves. And so I welcome anyone using this data set for really anything, and I'm happy to support you. What this looks like are a series of shapefiles. There's also CSV files where you have individual tree locations. And so each site might have, 1 million trees, 2 million trees. Each of them are labeled with the LiDAR height data, the max LiDAR height, and their geographic location. And that's been available for about a year now, maybe two. And they are dense polygon estimates that I think could be really promising both for ecology study as well as remote sensing study. Many of you are interested in tree detections, but frankly, where a lot of the fun is in species, right? So we've labeled them with bounding boxes so far, but we can't tell you anything about what type of tree that is. That's where we were in 2021. And so it was obvious that moving towards species prediction in this data array was the next step. It should be, again, obvious that this is quite difficult. And I want to try to describe why in a couple different examples, because I think in the literature, it's been smoothed over a little bit. If you look at a lot of the papers, again, you'll see these 80, 90% accuracy evaluation scores that I don't think reflect the experience of prediction in very large landscapes. I'm not calling to question those papers, but rather thinking about what was the lived experience of someone trying to go and use those data or those models in new geographic locations or broader geographic extents in the same general area. So here are 3 spectrum of individual trees at one of our sites in Florida. You're looking at a 3-band false color image of the hyperspectral data. And on the x-axis here is the band number moving from visible spectrum to hyperspectral. And so these peaks here are mostly visible spectrum here. I would say most of the discrimination happens here in the sort of near hyperspec area. I've seen some nice plots basically showing that all of the discrimination between tree species is in the hyperspectral. You are overlaying multiple years of data. You can see there's quite a bit of noise among years. And what we're trying to do is assign a species label to each individual crown box. There are a number of challenges that, again, we need to break down and try to address. First, I would say that trying to get far down the abundance distribution is very difficult compared to standard computer vision benchmarks. When we look at the abundance distribution of trees species at a large scale, we might be looking at species that in the prediction landscape are 1,000,000 to 1, or let's say 500,000 to 1 in terms of their relative abundances. No computer vision benchmark has that kind of class imbalance, right? Even things that are labeled class imbalance benchmarks are talking about 500 to 1. And so the kinds of rarity we're talking about when trying to get pretty far down the abundance distribution for individual trees is a very difficult and frankly somewhat unexplored area of remote sensing. It's not difficult to go for the first 4 species, but can you get to species 14? And that is really the crux. And for biodiversity studies, often people want the rarer things are of interest. And so this is a challenge wherein the thing that we're worst at predicting, or I shouldn't say worst, the hardest thing to predict is the thing that people are most interested in. It should be said that a lot of tree species are similar, both in terms of their leaf morphology as well as their spectral presentation. And so this is a type of fine-grained classification, and there are certain methods that we're going to need to use to try to attack that. Another really key thing that I think has been missing from the literature when I started to read this was the role of data pollution among neighboring trees. And so I wanted to take you sort of through that briefly, because again, I'm interested in people's feedback, as well as trying to highlight what I think a general problem in remote sensing is, not just for trees, but this is a ground truth versus sensor array challenge, right? Humans went out and were collecting individual stem data for neon plots. So they're standing there at the tree stem. And for example, they're collecting metadata here about whether it's live or dead. They're going to collect the species data as well. These are geospatial points at the stem. We need to associate those with sensor pixels coming from above. How to do that in a 3-dimensional landscape? Think of all the challenges that have to go from a single point on the ground to a set of pixels from above. And so we try to filter them by their health status when we know them. We're going to overlay predicted bounding boxes on top of them and try to come up with heuristic algorithms that describe which points should go to which box. It's clear that we're not always going to be successful in associating points between boxes and labels. And that's going to lead both to pollution of the label as well as pollution of the pixel, wherein you might have overlapping trees. So let's find one that doesn't look so good. Here. I don't like this one, right? So you can see that there's actually a second tree back in there. One tree there, there's probably another tree there. So our crown segmentation is going to take all of these pixels into account. And so we've played with a number of different algorithms to try to come up with ways of describing which pixels to choose. And I think, again, this is a very fertile area of work. How do we associate the correct remote sensing signal with the ground truth label is a general thing for both NASA as well as all other agencies to be really focusing on, because I think it's a challenging thing that I'm happy to talk about more if people are interested. I won't go through this too deeply, but I want to talk about a little bit about the kind of algorithmic approaches we've used to try to address these challenges. And so the first thing we're going to do is come up with a hierarchical organization before we even get to any of the deep learning parts of this. Is that we're going to use what we call mixture of experts approaches that try to partition the common species or the easy to delineate species from rare combinations or difficult combinations. And so for one site in Florida, we have a dominant species, P. palistris. That is over 60% of the site. And so the first question you have when you are inspecting a crown is this the dominant species or not? Why do this from a remote sensing perspective? Well, I think there's 3 reasons. One, it's easy to get out of the way and say this is either the most dominant thing or not. It's easy to develop features in that space that divide the dominant from all other classes. And so that kind of branching algorithm is very classical in machine learning. It also helps us deal with the class imbalance issue because the dominant species tends to be also the one we sample the most. And so we're now, without having to subsample or oversample or undersample any of the other ones, using the raw data, estimate whether we have the first most dominant class. From there, we can ask simple questions that delineate sets of other classes, for example, broadleaf or needleleaf. Excuse me. And then based on whether the answers of those particular models, we can take them to other submodels that again delineate among broadleaf or among leaf. In this case, we might even also take that further to say oak or non-oak. And so here we are trying to thin out the number of choices an algorithm has to make in hopes to try to refine that feature space. This is useful for both the class imbalance as well as the fine-grained nature of this. And then at the end, we'll ensemble those predictions to come up with a single tree species prediction at a higher level. The other thing I want to say about this, which is useful, is that we allow ourselves the opportunity to go up in coarse granularity of the labels so that perhaps for your carbon project, for example, you are only interested in broadleaf versus needleleaf. Maybe that is sufficient for the ecological detail of your project. The algorithm would allow you to then have a higher confidence in those higher taxonomic categories and allow you to sidestep some of the challenges of telling which oak species it is. The other, I think, important part of this workflow is the multi-temporal ensemble. Here, we're going to take the same geographic position for each bounding box and use multiple years of hyperspectral data and then combine them in a learned ensemble at the end. The combination of these two methods, the hierarchical ensembling and the multi-temporal ensembling, lead to superior models than sort of naive methods. The other thing that I think is really important that I don't see a lot in the research literature is we want to maintain the performance of the dominant class. It is possible to make trade-offs wherein you reduce the performance of the dominant class in exchange for rare species performance. But remember that 60% of our predictions are going to be the dominant class anyway. So you can't get away with just dropping that performance. We need methods that both keep the dominant performance strong as well as try to raise the performance of the rare species. So this was published in Ecological Applications a few months ago, and we have taken it a bit further in trying to apply this to many geographic areas. My latest accuracy, which is unpublished, so come back to me for final accuracy because it's always possible to change up or down, is at about 76% accuracy for 88 species at about 25 sites that we have NEON data. And so this is what we're creating, these large scale maps. You can zoom in on any individual one and you'll see individual tree predictions. Each of these, again, come with a height, geographic area, score, as well as an alive dead label, which can be helpful for some sites. These will be released probably by the end of summer, and I hope that they will be useful to both the forestry and ecology community. In the last few minutes, let's see how we're doing on time. Can't see my clock. Can someone throw me what time it is? I can't see the clock. Hold on.
You have about 17 minutes left.
There you go. There's no clock here. And so in the last few minutes, I want to take us from this individual sort of narrative, which I hope was informative, and talk about some larger lessons we've learned that I think are useful for this community, not just if you're interested in tree delineation, but really interested in anything within this general context that I think we've learned the very hard way. I want to, again, I usually sometimes put in a photo of myself like eating funnel cake here. We are not experts. We're simply people struggling. And so while I think we've learned some hard lessons, this shouldn't be confused for wisdom, but more just suffering. And so I hope we can talk a little bit about where we're going as a community and try to get some interaction here with everyone listening. And so one of the things that I mentioned before, but I think again is understudied, is this weird relationship between object detection and focal view. If you're interested in looking at this more on the Deep Forest docs, which is just read the docs Deep Forest, you'll see a couple examples of how if we change the patch size of the focal view, the algorithm, remember the weights are static, produces different predictions. I think this is a huge area of work that needs to be really understood better in the remote sensing community. We need algorithms that are much more robust to the field of view presentation as well as the resolution presentation. And I think that one of the ways that we know this is true is if we use the metaphor of human knowledge, right? I have never been to Argentina. I've never seen a tree in Argentina, but I can conceive of what Argentinian trees look like. Not only that, but I can conceive of what Argentinian trees look like from above. And so I have a semantic vision of a class which exists outside of any training experience, as well as any particular sensor array. And what's the challenge of current neural networks is that they live very deeply within a given sensor array. You're creating a neon 10 centimeter RGB data algorithm. And I think it should, often the papers or talks present them as a tree algorithm, but it's actually related to the data array. And what we need is some kind of understanding that exists in across sensors, so that a tree lives outside of a single data product. That is a big ask, but I think is one of the things we need to understand to move towards a more global remote sensing modeling community. We've released the crown, well, we're releasing, I should say, the crowns on Google Earth Engine for this reason. I am somewhat shaky on Google Earth Engine because I struggle with it sometimes, but I'm trying to get the data up and make it all work. And so what I hope that someone will do, maybe it's us, maybe it's one of you, maybe it's someone you know, will take these 100 million crowns and species predictions and crop out the sensor arrays that Google Earth Engine has. There's Landsat, there's MODIS, there's Sentinel, there's all the fun arrays. I actually think there's some Maxar data in there as well. And try to understand how we start training models at supermassive scales that exists at this broader perspective of what individual objects would be. And that might be trees, that might be something else. But I'm hopeful that one of the use cases for this data set that we're releasing is trying to move towards a more holistic understanding of semantic classes. And so stay tuned for that. If you know anyone who's super interested in Google Earth Engine, please let me know. I find it clunky and difficult. And if anyone wants to volunteer their time to make this work a little better, let me know. In the last 15 minutes or so, I want to talk a little bit about where we are in sort of the algorithm development space, but also as a sort of general workflow space. And this is where I hope we can all kind of contribute here. Everybody getting the thing. And we need an answer to this question. And you only get the answer of one of them, because I think it's this general problem we have right now is we're all kind of churning through our individual applications. You know, when you see a talk, it's about a specific thing and a specific data, and we're not really addressing what I think is the general challenge right now for remote sensing in communities like ours, which is that do we need better models, better data, or better theories? You only get to vote for one. Come up with an answer, and I'd like to sort of have a discussion either here or somewhere else. Seriously, in the chat, people start jawing here. Which of the things is the thing that we need to move forward as a community? Because right now, we're not answering this question, and we're still struggling to figure out how to move forward in a way that you have 10 years of research not just looking the same. And I think that one of the things I want to ask is, where are we going and how do we get there? I think data is interesting. I think models are interesting. I think theory is interesting, but we only get to work on some stuff. And so I think right now there's a lot of struggling to understand where we're going, and it still needs to be honest about how we're going to get there. Because we want to get to somewhere where we have plentiful models that are shared among tasks, that require small amounts of fine-tuning, and are openly accessible. How do we get there? And I think it's a really, really difficult question that I'm still personally struggling with. And we need, as a community, just start to think about why. So I'm going to give everybody 30 seconds to just kind of think about that. as we kind of move forward. Because the community is a very strong advocate for these global acquisition tools, but we're still not totally clear on how we unite in a way of developing models together. And I think it'd be a mistake to think that we could just like force ourselves into some single framework. Oh, if everyone used just PyTorch RetinaNet, it would be fine, right? But like, it's not totally going to work. So I'm still thinking about this question, and I want to engage with this, and I love feedback either now or later about how we try to move there. I asked this same question maybe a couple months back on our Slack channel. We run an AI for Slack channel. I think it's still through Microsoft AI for Earth. I don't even exist anymore. If any of you would like to join, you're welcome. Contact me or Sarah Beery at MIT. And I asked this question, which I thought was super interesting. There was a response. It's a highly biased sample, but here we are. And so I am of the opinion about the balloon here. Like, we need models that do things, but better algorithms won the day here. And I think it's still, again, really, really nice diversity of answers. I didn't know what was going to happen when I asked this question, and I still am trying to figure out how to interpret the result. It continued on for like another day, and basically all the numbers doubled. I think one of the things that everyone here has probably noticed in the last few weeks is that there has been a accelerating posturing in AI. We are feeling it, right? The community is starting to really cycle through expectations. And I swear it's like the post-crypto thing. Like, there's something happening right now in AI. And so as a community, I hope that we all can be advocates for thoughtful pronouncements moving forward. And we can all be on the right side of setting expectations, or else we're going to get ourselves in trouble. And so the AI development in this space in general is really taking off. And I think it's worth being cognizant of our responsibilities in setting the correct expectations. Okay, that being said, a couple other observations that I think has been really clear through this narrative is that models really rarely matter. And it's quite odd that we see a lot of papers that are focused on the modeling architecture, but when you go to actually look at either evaluation scores or you go to implement them, they're usually swamped out by the uncertainty we have. And so I think this gives away my answer to our last question, which is the data, I think, is the key aspect here. And we need a general sense about when models matter and why models matter. And so the challenge for data scientists is not to be endlessly chasing new models, but trying to come up with some kind of theory that describes when a particular model will be useful. And I think this is particularly important for self-supervision because we don't know when and why it matters. And so without knowing that, you can throw a lot of time at something and not be correct in associating your expectations with the actual evaluation scores. And I think we also need to be a little bit more, as a community of no doubt editors and reviewers in the room, a little more aggressive about thinking about our expectations for publications in this space. We need competitive baselines in every paper, right? That really look to find what has been done before and try to reproduce it in an aggressive way, so we understand how we move forward. We need to release data and code in a coherent and reproducible manner, and none of this like data is available on request. So if you're a reviewer for remote sensing of the environment and you see data is available on request, hold your ground. Hold your ground until they tell you that they can't anymore. And I think that that's the only way we're going to get forward on this. I die on every hill for no data available on request. The editor has to move me off of that. And I hope you can join me in that. We want to also be careful in conflating what we think a human performance and AI performance is on very large scales. It doesn't matter that individuals can count trees better at a 40-meter scale because we're talking about 100 million trees. And often what we're thinking about in the AI space is automating some task that humans were going to do. And so we get confused that human performance and AI performance are similar, but we're really focused on the scale here. And I think that is a very common challenge that I face. And lastly, I want to really harp on focusing on prediction and not evaluation as the goal. Evaluation is a way you describe trust to other people, but rather prediction is the thing you're trying to achieve. And if more articles could be focused in that way, it would help us understand the experience of a new person using those algorithms. I cannot stress enough that when we wrote this grant for NSF, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, this was like, what I showed you in this talk was like aim 1. And we had like 4 other aims because we thought the field had already done all this stuff because we weren't part of this. And so we had read all the papers, and then we went to actually do it. We found that it just didn't match our lived experience. And so we had 4 other aims that we sort of got to, but we spent a lot of time on this. And I think that that really is important and a lesson that certainly I've learned. Where am I? Here we go. Again, computer vision is moving quickly, and so we still need to figure out where we are. My lab mate Sergio Marconi took Deep Forest, for example, the other week, and associated it with Segment Anything, Meta's new semantic segmentation model, to make polygons out of the bounding boxes. If people are interested in this, please contact Sergio if you need polygons. I'm still open to when we need bounding boxes versus polygons in remote sensing. This is a big question in my mind. Are the extra vertices worth it? But this really shows that there's going to be new developments, and we need to stay both focused on what our challenges are and not chase new things, but also be open to where new innovation will come from. And I think this was a wonderful example from Sergio. I'm going to skip this because we're running out of time. The last thing I want to say is the thing that I really want to stress for machine learning development in this space is we're really working in this very linear narrative right now between data collection and application, where we like one team collects data. Usually it's a different set of people. It's handed off to a new set of people to develop a model. That team evaluates it and writes a paper, and usually hands off to another team to apply it. I think this is one of the challenges with where we are right now. And I want to offer a different avenue and a way of thinking about the workflow that we've been more successful with. So instead of thinking about this as a linear process, I really hope we can think about this more as a cyclical process, wherein in 10 years from now, we will have existing models for the common remote sensing tasks. And you will be able to take that down and evaluate it on your set of data, do something to it, make a prediction, and then explicitly collect new data in reference to the current model performance. And so what I want to harp on is that model algorithm development and data collection need to be coupled in a very tight kind of way. And so this is an argument for active learning. It's an argument for sort of the less siloed nature of machine learning development. And this has been really one of the important parts of our species work that I think can be really valuable moving forward. Because when we talk about literally our tree species, we have this challenge, right? We need more data. Which trees to sample? You know, there's a million trees out there. Which trees and which individual trees should we send humans to try to get new labels? We've been exploring the idea perhaps of using unmanned aerial vehicles to automate some of the tree sampling work. I'm happy to talk about that if people are interested in it. But this is a challenge I think most people are interested in for lots of remote sensing tasks. And I think it's still trying to unpack how we make workflows that reflect the best possible algorithm development. And with that, I think I'm about out of time, and I'm happy to take questions anytime, anywhere. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, I just want to give a big round of applause. That was a fantastic presentation. There, I can see all the hands going off of everyone applauding. That was so fantastic. Thank you so much. I know we got plenty of hands going up, which is fantastic. Let's just do some questions around the room. Kevin, go ahead.
Yeah, Ben, I'll just say thank you very much for your presentation. I really like this higher level question that you're asking with this is just, what do we really need more? We have tons of algorithms out there now. We have tons of data, and do we have the right definitions or theories going on? And it just makes us to step back and really consider, like, And how are we evaluating these things based on what we really want out of it? And
Totally.
and is it going to be capture the full scope of the utility of it eventually when it comes down to it? Is it going to give us the information we need to make the higher level scientific models than just the computer algorithm models? So maybe that's just a statement, but I appreciate that question. It's made me think at a new level.
Totally. And I think one of the other pieces here that is so valuable, before I let Jacob answer, is that, we're still trying to figure out our relationship between all these different parts of the organization, right? I'm an academic, some of you are federal scientists, and we also probably have some people from private here. How do we combine those pieces as well, I think is another big question. And I'll let Jacob ask a question before, but if anyone in chat, is responsible for NASA's relationship with some of these private organizations like Planet or Maxar, let me know. Because I'm still interested in figuring out where these things start and end and how we should engage with them and what does it mean to have, a lot of our remote sensing data coming from private companies. These are big questions. But anyways, Jacob, go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much, Ben. That was a great presentation. I was wondering, you talked a lot about the neon sites that were used. So do you have challenges when applying it to areas outside of the United States and areas? Is it hard to find a place with similar data that you can then run this on?
For species, we haven't done it yet. And that's probably the next step. The models are not very portable yet, right? Because they're highly constructed, they have this hierarchical structure. They're not portable or they're not obviously portable to new areas. And it's something we need to do. One of the things that I think I'm trying to unpack in my mind is how we select from, if you have a panoply of models, right? If you have 30 models and you have some new geographic area, how to choose which model to start from and how to combine from them. It's easy to do when you have the data, but if you have all of these models, I've seen methods, for example, zipping models together with model weights. I think it's a really important area of work. The second thing I'd say that we don't know about, I don't have a good answer for your question at all, is which bands and how many bands are really needed, right? So for a lot of the UAV data, you're only going to get 8 to 10 bands, and they're going to be much broader than the 369 bands we have. One of the projects I'd like to do is artificially coarsen the data in lots of different ways and ask, where do we actually need the spectral information and how few bands can we get away with and what are they tuned to, I think is a really valuable thing. If you or anyone here has any ideas about how we simulate in a reasonable way other hyperspectral signals, please let me know. I'm not sure that just average, if you have 30 bands and you take the average of them, is that really a band collected across those 30 nanometers? Does everyone know what I'm trying to say? Like, it's not real. Is that really a good representation of that? And so if anyone is in a hyperspectral sensing expert in the room, how do we simulate reasonable reflectances from the current reflectances we have? Sorry, Jacob, wasn't a great answer.
No, thank you. I appreciate it. And I was actually also, if I could throw out one more question,
Go for it.
I was wondering, have you thought about applying this at all to commodity tree crops like oil palm or cocoa or things like that?
It's been done for deep forest. There's oil palm seems to be an area that people are using deep forest a lot. It works well because it's plantations. I'm very focused on the tool development and trying to figure out how we make this available to a large group of people. And people have taken it in all sorts of different directions. For these plantations, I think my big question is, and I'm sure everyone at NASA cares about too, is at what spatial resolution can we actually attain the information we need? I've had meetings with the World Resource. I saw John Brandt give a talk to this group. World Resources Institute, for example, right, who want to use planet data at 50 centimeters to track reforestation. What do we mean by individual trees at those areas? And what information can we extract, for example, about oil palm plantations from planet level data or planet scope data? I still don't know.
Gotcha. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'd be interested to look into some of that work that's been done with deep forest on oil palm. That sounds really cool. Thanks.
Biplav, do it.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. That was a great presentation. So you talked a little bit about your ongoing effort on getting those data sets into Earth Engine. Can you
Yeah.
talk a little bit about that? Because this group heavily uses Earth Engine. Most of our services in SERVIR are built on Earth Engine. So if we have data over there, I think it's a great way for us to tap into some of those data sets that you're sharing. So would be
So
interested to learn, like, is it the I think you talked about neon crown data. Are you thinking about those data sets, or is it about getting the model itself into the Earth
the
Engine?
data set, starting with the data sets. Let's start with just the data. And so I have uploaded, and it's there right now. I can just put it in there. A sample site of, I think it's 4 million bounding boxes. It is incredibly slow to visualize and move. Part of this is two different aims. One is a visualization aim, right? We want to overlay this. Neon is putting their data on Earth Engine right now. And so there will be 10 centimeter neon data there. And part of it is analysis. So for analysis, I'm starting working with the GE map thing, and I've talked to the developer. And so we're still trying to figure out how to upload them and engage with them the right way. But there will be individual file assets for each of these geographic sites up on Earth Engine. I mean, I could do it today, but still trying to figure out how to make visualization servers that actually, so you could scroll through them in some way. For example, every time you double click and zoom in, it re-renders the whole thing and it takes like 4 minutes. So it's totally unusable. And so that kind of thing, I'm still trying to figure out how to use that. And I would say philosophically, it's the same question I have about Maxar and Planet. I'm still not sure about Earth Engine in terms of Google could turn that thing off tomorrow, right? Like, how much time and effort should we be spending engaging with that? We have no assurances that they'll keep it there, and they've killed cheaper things faster, right? And so I'm still unsure about what our relationship are with these different companies and how we rely on them for essential things within the scientific community. It's nothing against Google. I've taken grants from them before, but it's still unclear in my mind how our relationship should be there and what development looks like in those spaces.
Yeah, thank you. And maybe just continuing on that conversation, you're absolutely right that Google might shut down those things down. So is there some sort of maybe a common cloud in a standard or format, like a stack version, that we
Right,
could
right.
think about, that maybe could also be applied in AWS, because many of the NASA computing resources are on AWS. So maybe there's some sort of a common cloud standard that we can think about. Just a thought.
Yeah, totally. And I would love to talk more about that, because figure out what it is that would do it to make it look the way that NASA scientists would expect. We should definitely connect on that, because I don't know the data formats.
Sounds good. Thank you.
A deal.
Hi, Ben. It's been a great presentation indeed. I just wanted to ask that, do you have any experiences using coarser resolution data for tree height prediction, for example, using JEDI or ISET2, where areas there are no high resolution data sets available? I'm talking about, like, I'm from Pakistan, so there are like areas in Himalaya, Western Himalaya. So do you have any experiences using JEDI for like tree height mapping or ISET2, or any experiences with that?
No, I think one of the things that we are interested in is partnering with teams that are experienced with these different data products, right? I don't know yet how to combine. So the thing with JEDI that confuses me, which is probably the wrong community to say this to, is how you handle the strip mapping, right? Because it's not wall to wall. I don't get it. And so I don't know how to make sense of that in terms of creating the kinds of data products we've been imagining, right? Because we're thinking about these contiguous maps. And so the whole acquisition structure of JEDI exists in a very different framework. Yeah. And so I would love to hear a proposal or some kind of theory about how we go from those data to the kinds of models we've been developing. I don't yet know what that would look like. But I think it's an important area. Clearly, JEDI is going to be around. But there's still something about that transition I don't quite follow.
Right. Thank you.
Ate.
Yeah, you pronounced my name right, which is great. Thanks for this very nice presentation. So for the model architecture that you're using, how many variables do you have in your model?
Oh God, I think it's 33 million. I think, and that's even an exaggeration too, because right, they're ensembled on top of each other. So it's an stack of 30. It's 33 million times each year times each model level, right? So I don't know if you consider them independent or not, but hundreds of millions.
Okay, that's really huge. And if you have you tried running these boxes through any of the conventional object detection algorithms like a YOLO or grounding dyno?
Well,
using a pre-trained network.
So it does build off of RetinaNet, which is like 2017 level stuff. The YOLO and grounding dyno are all newer, well, the newer version of YOLO. It all works. It's just a question of providing the data that gets the geographic scale. I think we could rebuild Deep Forest off of YOLO tomorrow. I think it would provide no real difference. And in fact, one of the things we hope to do with Deep Forest is make it sort of agnostic to the modeling framework. I'm hopeful that if the community actually wants it, we could have something where it would have a train step and a predict step and, you know, the kind of essential nature of it. And if you were interested in that particular algorithm, then you would be able to plug it in and be able to have access to our data in that kind of way. My experience is that trading up model architectures at most gives you 2 to 3% in performance. You know, this one's like 3% better there, that one's 2% better there, but it's never 20% better. That has never happened to me yet.
No.
The data makes the thing, not the algorithm.
Yeah, and have you tried using pre-trained networks, using just the normal ImageNet dataset, for example?
Yeah, it does. It just provides really weak bounding box definitions. All it does is create these big, because they're used to really large. One of the challenges with remote sensing that we are struggling with is that a lot of we're porting from baselines and benchmarks from what I love the phrase egocentric view. They're like people with photos. And so they're the huge bounding boxes. So the anchor generators have been used to like cat on the screen, and it's like really big and there's a clear cat. And you really do see that kind of ghost when you apply the pre-trained images to ours, is that they create giant boxes with very weak edge definitions, because all the pre-training and everything it's learned is like, there's a horse here and then a plane. And carpeting the image with thousands of boxes is just not what ImageNet was set up to do. And frankly, not what any of these pre-training networks were set up to do. You know, even like the ship detector ones is like an ocean and then there's like a little ship. And, you know, we have thousands of boxes per image.
Thank you.
Any other questions on the line? Well, I do have a couple. I was really happy to sort of hear your discussion on what do we do next when we maybe want to start exploring planet and like the nuances of that.
For sure.
And a lot of the folks who are here on the call, you know, they're calling in from around the SERVIR hubs, and like NICFI planet data is sort of a lifeline on a lot of different applications they're exploring right now. And I think that's a very exciting frontier that I think, you know, folks on this line may want to start just trying out. And your insights, I think, are both scary and also really invigorating on what you could do.
What is the relationship between NASA and Planet? Like, help me understand how we think about these relationships.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting topic, especially with SERVIR. You know, our role, you know, we sort of really interface with the private sector quite a bit and help to facilitate applications of a lot of those platforms in real world instances. So using that data, either free or private, to actually, result in some changes on the ground. So in that sense, we have the ability to get sort of first access to a lot of these things, or privilege access, which is great. But we also do form a lot of relationships with folks from Planet, for instance. So I know I saw a couple messages in there with like Sam Roy, who's now at Maxar. It's a great example of someone who has helped to find a lot of solutions for us while we're exploring a lot of these things for application. So, and then for the broader NASA sense, I mean, there is huge divisions of NASA that are helping to facilitate those conversations and making pipelines for things like NICV data. Because right now, I would imagine like NASA Impact, for instance, they're trying to get that data in the cloud for the next generation of using these platforms. So I think this is a conversation that like we should just continue having and kind of like connect you to some folks too. Because one of the things I was thinking about you brought up sort of this Socratic question of, what do we do next with these model platforms? And, Tensor Hub for our group was a kind of an interesting area where you would have a staged model that someone could just call in from the cloud and run. And
Right.
That's something kind of exciting, also, a little worrying too. But I think we can probably follow up over email, but that's an exciting frontier.
So Go ahead.
Go ahead. Oh, go ahead.
Because I was asking things, what's some of the stuff springs to mind? Like if I train a model with data that's been provided by one of these companies, what is their relationship to that model? What's the release structure? That kind of like, these kinds of things where, NASA has outsourced some of the near Earth imaging to these private companies. It's still unclear to me about how we want to move forward with that. It's obviously tremendous data, but also from the reforestation perspective, where you see a lot of people interested in this carbon capture or carbon credits kind of thing, they're going to play a very integral role. And I'm just still trying to understand how, as academics, we're going to engage with that community and what that's going to literally look like in terms of publication, in terms of dollars, in terms of developers. And I'm interested in hearing from everyone here what your experience in working with them has been like.
Yeah, I'll quickly add my 2 cents and let other folks jump in. I mean, I know from on the NASA side, we're really trying to position towards this transformation to open science, and all the NICV data that we're using, we're actually buying as a commercial satellite data program, and then we're able to use those and derive products from. So in that sense, we're kind of covering the way in which we use this data and then make products out of it.
Yeah.
And then how does that filter to the academic society to actually use this data now that it's open? So I'm actually very happy. I'm pleasantly, I'm in a good sense very happy that I think this will become more and more open. Because that's sort of the posturing of NASA, and I think other agencies will also be moving in that direction. So then the question is, how do we effectively use this data now that there's a bigger and bigger pipe coming? So that's my 2 cents. Other folks online, feel free to jump in.
And also any other questions as well, but you don't have to get sidetracked on this stuff. Going once, going twice.
Oh, go ahead, Biplab.
Yeah, sorry,
Go ahead.
last question.
Yeah.
So you also said that you also have like tons of data that you haven't been able to use. What's your plan with those data? I mean, you talked about maybe having some sort of unsupervised, algorithm that people can quickly transfer, learn, and tune their data. And there's so much hype about foundational models coming in and how those can also be used in geospatial community. Maybe that's something of the line. I don't know what your plans are.
That's basically it. I mean, so we're trying to figure out how to move forward within the context of a different set of options, right? You could have tool development, right? We can make deep forest better. We can make it more clear how to make multi-class models and evaluate them, and provide avenues by which people can train simple models quickly. That's one area. That might involve tutorials, that might involve a lot of outreach. That's kind of things. We could try to build models that predict other things, right? So for example, we've done trees. Our wildlife community is very interested in birds, in any large mammals, in wildlife, right? So there's making tools and APIs that allow you to train models. There's models that do stuff. And then there's providing the multi-sensor transfer array kind of approaches that I talked a little bit about, the hyperspec species, for example. Those are three very different ways of proceeding. For the very literal data sets we have with deep forest, we know there's this cross generalization challenge we're having across resolutions, which is still very interesting to me. And so we have, I don't know, probably 25,000 boxes I've collected, 30,000 boxes from other research papers. Every time I see a research paper, I email them, I hound them, and we try to get as much data as we can. And there's a big issue on deep forest, like integrate other large data sets. That's just waiting for someone or me or someone else to train a new model and see if it performs better. I think we are, for the 10 centimeter data, starting to run into how close we are to human level performance in terms of annotation. So we're getting to the place of like, if it's two annotators are close to about 80% accurate to each other. And so we're like 72, 73% accurate. So it's very hard to know whether adding new data will actually make the model performance better with relative to evaluation criteria, because we're not totally sure the evaluation criteria is any better than the model. And that's starting to be where we are, because it's hard to tell. Like, you look at this image we're looking at right now, how many trees are in this image? Would you really want to do that? Would you really want to label them by bounding boxes? It's hard. And so we're still not sure about the next step forward. And I welcome feedback about what we think the remote sensing community really needs, whether it's models that do stuff, platforms that do stuff, or data sharing. You know, I'm open to what we think is possible.
Yeah, I think that's such a key question, and I actually had like just a statement off of that of, you know, our hubs around the world through SERVIR, you know, they're working with forestry groups, they're working with community level forestry groups, collecting data, sort of developing a lot of the protocols for collecting that information. And I think there might be a conversation we should probably also have of like, how do we gear these collections to be more oriented, not only for remote sensing, which is, I think, on that horizon, but for deep learning and for quantity and the quality. And because I do think that that's going to be such a challenge, and that also starts to open doors for, you know, locations where we may not have such high resolution images to begin with. What do we do then? And that's really, really sort of challenging, but exciting.
And I think it goes back to this question of like, okay, a lot of remote sensing is going to be collecting ground truth data underneath a canopy, whether it's trees, whether it's agriculture, whether it's, you know, refugee camps. There's going to be this challenge between remote sensing pixel arrays and ground truth geospatial points, and how we link them together, I think, is an area of real work. You can imagine, for example, we've talked about this but never done it, a deep learned space where you could try to pull out weak labeled points based on they're too close. So if you had like if you were like, oh, this thing's labeled red maple, but it's sitting too close to the centroid of black spruce, and that one's probably a bad data point, throw that out. Some kind of automated way of trying to troll through remote sensing data for sets of general classes and say, in the embedded space, we are looking at ground truth points, either in train or test, that look too similar to other points because of data pollution. I think it's going to be a general challenge moving forward, and that relates to how the data was collected. You know, we've argued endlessly about polygons versus bounding boxes. We've argued about point locations. We're in the field versus people looking at the images, and coming up with some kind of standard protocol and investigating that protocol in a quantitative way, I think is a real role here for someone. You know, there's just a lot here. We've come up with this heuristic algorithm, but in no way is it perfect. And I think it is probably one of the key aspects moving forward and trying to understand this relationship between ground truth rumors and sensor arrays.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that's more to come, and
Yeah.
hopefully, we can find an opportunity to sort of collaborate if that's the case. But
Absolutely. All right, I think I've got to go to my next set of meetings. Thanks everyone for your time. Please email me. You can Slack me. If anyone wants on that Slack group, you can write me. We're around, and look for that data. It'll be up on Earth Engine soon. And I'll send maybe I'll reply all with a link to that Earth Engine link or something like that.
Yeah.
Yes, I can't thank you enough. Go ahead, Biplav.
Yeah, thank you so much. And Ben, you'll also be sharing your presentation slides, right?
It's already in there. I already
Okay.
put it in there.
Yeah, I'll share those, and I'll also share the recording. Thank you so much, Ben. That was great talk.
Bye, guys.
Bye. Thank you.